Chapter 4. The Witch. The plain stretched southward under a pewter sky. Here and there the ground showed black where winds had scoured away the snow, exposing naked earth. Once more, Conan paused in his trudging to glance back along the path that he had travelled. Straining his ears, he heard the telltale whining and knew that wolves were still on his trail. From the distance came their eerie song. He scowled, set his jaw, and gathered his bearskin cloak about him. If only, in all this bleak, flat stretch of land, he could find a rocky place to shield him. Something to put his back against. He could face the pack and use his dagger to good advantage. Grimly, the Cimmerian turned to plod ahead, but in the dull, metallic luminescence of the motionless mist, he could not see his surroundings clearly. He strode along, nevertheless, his keen barbarian eyes searching for a haven against the hungry fangs. At last he found one. It was only a low rise, a wrinkle in the earth's skin, but the higher ground was strewn with boulders. On the crest of this small rise, he hoped to make his stand, for there the beasts could come at him only singly, or at the worst in pairs. As he began to clamber up the rocky pile, his booted feet slipped on the sheathing ice. A cold wind came up and tugged at his cloak, as if to hold him back. Still, he persevered and made some progress. Pausing to catch his breath at last, he turned to see a dozen gaunt, dark-furred forms lope into view. The wolves' eyes burned like glowing coals through the gathering murk, as the grey light faded from the clouded heavens. Seeing their quarry trying to escape, the pack broke into a chorus of snarls. Just before the foremost reached the foot of the rock pile, Conan found a smooth, upright slab, which thrust up from the side of the knoll. In shape, it was oddly symmetrical, as though hewn by artisans of some forgotten race and set there for a marker. Conan neither knew or cared about that. The slab was something he could stand against, something to protect his back. Whining and growling, the wolves threaded a passage between the boulders, scrambling for footholds as they clawed their way up the rough hillside. One leaped high in the air to snap at the Cimmerian's leg, but a slash of his dirk caught the beast across its muzzle. With a yelp of pain, it fell back, giving its prey a moment's respite. As he inched along the ledge that fronted the vertical slab, in search of a more secure footing, Conan's fingers found a narrow gap in the rock. A quick glance revealed a dark opening, just wide enough for a man to slip through sidewise. Once inside the sheltering cleft, however small the space, he knew that he would gain an advantage against his pursuers. Lithe as a panther, Conan wriggled through the slot in the stone, but his cloak caught on a jagged rock and was torn from his shoulders. Through the aperture, he watched the wolves hurl themselves upon the fur, their fangs ripping the bear's hide to ribbons. For some reason that he could not fathom, the animals did not even try to squirm through the opening. From the way they whined and scratched against the slab, he sensed that, starving though they were, they feared to pass through this mysterious stone portal. Turning, Conan found himself in a larger space than he had expected, a stone-walled cubicle with a flat, stone-paved floor. The regularity of the floor and the walls gave the barbarian youth an uneasy premonition that the chamber had been fashioned by intelligent beings, human or otherwise. He felt his way in the dark along the smooth wall and came to an opening through which a flight of smoothly chiseled stone steps descended into deeper darkness. he followed them to their foot. On the lower level, the floor seemed littered with debris, rotted cloth intermixed with hard lumps that he could not at first identify. He gathered up a handful of the unseen litter, wondering if it was combustible. He felt in his pouch for the flint and steel he had taken from the dead Hyrcanian. Soon he had a small flame burning, for the cloth was dry and ignited easily. By this feeble orange light, Conan saw that the walls were embellished with polished stone reliefs, an intricate mixture of bizarre figures and forms unknown to him. Examining the floor, he found it cluttered with skulls and bones, the remains of at least a score of human beings. He saw that the bones were clean and dry, the flesh having long since disintegrated into dust. Peering deeper into the gloom, Conan discovered a huge throne, carved from a block of some opalescent material, such as marble or alabaster. On this seat of honor sat an enormous skeletal warrior, still clad in copper armor of a strange design, turned green by the corrosion of many years. Conan guessed that the living man whose bones these were had been half again as tall as he, perhaps a member of a long-forgotten race. Lighting his way with a rude torch fashioned from a femur wrapped in a piece of rotting cloth, Conan approached the armed figure. Beneath the shadow of his heavy helm, the face of the skull seemed frozen in a silent scream. Across the spread knees of the armoured skeleton lay a great sword, sheathed in leather so rotted that patches of iron beneath the hide were visible. The hilt and pommel of corroded bronze crawled with cryptic characters, wrought by a master's hand. Conan took up the sword. At the touch of his fingers, the scabbard crumbled into dust, and thin fragments of bronze fell to the floor with the ghost of a tinkle. The blade, now fully exposed, proved to be a huge length of dull iron, spotted with patches of corrosion. But rust had not bitten it deeply enough to affect its strength. The edge, when Conan thumbed it, was still sharp. Conan's eyes clouded with painful memories as he caressed the perfect planes of the blade and the exquisite workmanship of the hilt. He recalled the making of the great steel sword that was his father's masterpiece. Shrugging the memory away, Conan hefted the ancient weapon. Heavy as it was, he found the balance so perfect that it seemed made for his arm alone. He raised the sword above his head and felt the thews swell with power, and his heart beat faster with the pride of possession. With such a blade, no destiny would be too high for a warrior to aspire to. With such a blade, even a barbarian slave, a pit fighter scorned and marked for death, might hack his way to an honoured place among the rulers of the earth. Exhilarated by the dreams that the splendid weapon aroused in his barbarian breast, Conan fainted and cut the air with wild abandon. And as the keen sword sliced through the stale air of the death chamber, he uttered the venerable war cry of the Cimmerians. Loud and clear he shouted it, and the cry reverberated around the chamber, disturbing ancient shadows and age-old dust. In his exuberance, the young barbarian never paused to think that such a challenge, wide-flung in such a place, might rouse thoughts and feelings that had slumbered there for countless centuries, among the bones of those whose thoughts they were. Suddenly, Conan heard an answering war cry. It seemed to come from a great distance, carried on the wind. But there was no wind. Conan paused, his sword arm still upraised. Was it perhaps the wolves that howled? Again the mad cry rose, so near now that it beat against his ears and deafened him. Conan wheeled. He felt the hair lift from his scalp and his blood congeal to ice. For the dead man lived and moved. Slowly, the skeleton rose from the marble throne, glaring at the Cimmerian youth, from the deep pits now filled, it seemed, with demonic fire. Bone rubbed against bone, like tree branches brushing together in a storm, as the terrible grinning skull approached on funereal feet. Conan, his arm still raised, stood frozen by horror into immobility. Suddenly, a bony claw shot out to snatch the sword from Conan's hand. Numb with terror, Conan retreated step by step. Only the Cimmerian's laboured breath and the clicking of bones against the stone floor of the chamber broke the silence. Now the dead thing had Conan backed against a wall. Pit fighter though he was, ready to do battle with man or beast and fearing neither pain nor mortal foes. He was still a barbarian, and like all barbarians, he feared the terrors of the grave and the monstrous beings that inhabit the dark world and the hells beneath hells. The small torch burned low as he stood, paralyzed by fear. Then a wolf howled. Galvanized into action by that familiar sound, Conan's terror melted like the snow in spring. He brought the sword down with a chopping blow that lopped off the clutching bony claw. He swiveled to the side and, in the sputtering light, searched vainly for the stairs down which he had come. Relentlessly, the helmeted skull strode forward. With swift, powerful strokes, Conan defended himself. At last, he found the narrow stairs, and backing up a single step, he drove his weapon through the rusted armour, through the bare ribcage, and into the area where a living heart would beat. With a sigh like sedge blown by an autumn wind, the walking skeleton paused in mid-step. The giant form reeled, took 2 tottering steps towards the throne, and collapsed into a heap of bones and dust. The helmet rang like a cracked bell when it struck the stone flooring. Then the torch flickered and went out. For a moment, the Cimmerian stood staring into the darkness, unable to comprehend that his supernatural adversary was truly dead, and that the great sword was his. Then he turned, and holding his weapon at the ready, mounted the stairs. At last, Conan emerged into the moonlight to find the wolves still waiting for him. Howling, they bounded towards him, tongues lolling from their fanged jaws. With a tight smile, he took his stance on the ledge and raised the long blade over his head. As the first beast hurled itself towards him, Conan pivoted, sweeping his sword in a horizontal arc. Caught in mid-leap, the wolf was tossed high in the air and fell, yelping, to its death on the boulders. Before the Cimmerian could lift his sword arm to deliver another slashing blow, a second wolf sprang at him, its jaws agape. In the white light of the moon, he drove the point of his blade between the open jaws, seating it deep in the animal's gullet. The wolf's legs scrambled frantically on the rounded surface of a boulder as it tried, in vain, to tear itself loose from the impaling blade. At that instant, a third wolf dove at Conan from the side, snapping at his legs. Still encumbered by the spitted animal, Conan kicked out, in time to catch the new attacker on its nose. The beast drew back with a yelp, then made another dive, but Conan, having freed his sword, dealt the attacker a blow that laid open its skull. With 3 of their number down, the remaining wolves drew back. Whining, they trotted off, tails low, and disappeared into the low-lying mists. Conan spent the night, a long and wearisome time, hidden among the boulders on the upland, alert to the twin dangers of further attacks by hungering beasts, or by walking dead men from the nearby cave. In the grey dawn, he skinned the 3 dead wolves and, tying the skins together, made a crude mantle for protection against the cold. Some of the flesh he roasted over a small fire and ate with ravenous enjoyment. Some he wrapped in the skin of a wolf's leg to assuage his hunger during the journey southward. The sword Conan slung on his back, thrust through the dead soldier's belt and secured there by a string of animal sinews. Thus outfitted and provisioned, he clambered down the rock pile and, sighting on a pallid sun, headed south. 3 days later, the level tundra had given way to a vista of gently rolling hills crowned with scrub timber. The ground beneath his feet had grown soft from the melting of the lingering snows, and clear water ran in rills from tunnels in the thawing drifts. In the distance, a lazy pillar of smoke wavered upward to meet the high overcast. Conan headed for the place whence the smoke ascended, and coming to a clearing, found a stone-walled, sod-roofed dwelling dug into the side of a hill. Curiously carved wooden poles jutted from the earth at crazy angles about the hut, like a flimsy palisade. Several standing stones had been rudely chipped into the semblance of human heads, grimacing or shouting into the uncaring wind. His primitive instincts attuned to the supernatural, Conan could almost feel the emanations of evil power arising from these cryptic sticks and stones. The door of the hut stood ajar, and the barbarian approached it, moving with the feline caution of a stalking leopard. Suddenly he stopped, rigid with amazement. For tethered by a chain to a heavy stone post, he saw a crouching figure, wrapped in ragged furs. It was a man, squat, bow-legged and half-naked, who with the eyes of an injured animal regarded the newcomer. Voiceless and unmoving as the stone against which he huddled, the short man stared at the young Cimmerian from slitted, ebon eyes. Suddenly, a voice as clear as a cowbell in the gloaming jolted Conan from his curious contemplation. "There is warmth in fire." The voice was soft and inviting. Conan raised his eyes to see a woman's figure silhouetted against the firelight from her hearth. Her curvaceous body, pressed against the portal of her home, radiated a sinister but inviting mystery. Her languid, smiling eyes ran down the strong body of the Cimmerian youth, exuding an eroticism as strong as a caress. "Do you not wish to warm yourself by my fire?" Her face, framed by her long black hair, was past the bloom of youth, but there was a compelling beauty in it that was as old as time. Conan, restrained by his premonition of evil, hesitated for a heartbeat, while the woman, with a secret smile, turned from the doorway to stoke her fire of tamarisk chips. Drawn by her easy manner and the glow of her oval face in the firelight, Conan ducked under the low lintel and entered the hut. The fire leaped up, and by its roseate glow, Conan studied the room. The stone walls were enhanced by hanging of animal hides. The floor was covered by skins of luxuriant softness, but of beasts unfamiliar to the Cimmerian. Strange skulls were suspended from the twin posts that supported the sod roof. Bears with great teeth, saber-fanged cats, and one horned beast of indescribable immensity. Before the fire, the woman spread a low table with a wooden platter of barley bread and goat cheese, a bowl of dried fruit, and a mug of fresh milk. Then she beckoned to him, and gratefully he settled down to enjoy the repast. Sated, he looked up to find the woman leaning against the nearer centre post, studying him. An expression of amusement curled her full-lipped mouth. "From the north, that is whence you come," she said in her throaty voice. Suddenly aware that the woman had been staring at him, Conan looked down, uneasy. His hand dropped to the sword now lying by his side. "I am a Cimmerian," he said. The woman, noting the youth's ardent glance and evident embarrassment, laughed harshly. "You are a slave. Do you not think that I can see a slave by his eyes? Barbarian slave." There was an uneasy silence. Then, with a sinuous movement, the woman tossed back her long hair and prowled about the room with an unsettling, erotic grace. Something about her shadow, not quite where it should be, disturbed the barbarian youth. "Where do you go to, Cimmerian?" she demanded. Conan shrugged. "To the south." "Why?" she persisted, smiling, a touch of cruelty in her expression. Conan threw her a brief glance. "They say it is warmer there, and they ask few questions of strangers. Besides, there is gold to be earned by a man who can use a sword." The woman bent over the fire and threw a powder into the hot coals. Suddenly, the flames roared up, then fell away. She studied the surge of flame, her lips curling, then said, "Gold, women, thievery, that's civilization. What would a savage like you know of civilized life? But it matters not. In a short time your spine will be nailed to a tree." The woman poured the barbarian a cup of wine, then stood staring at him with rising sexual interest. Under her soft robe, her voluptuous breasts rose and fell as her breathing quickened. A strange light shone in the depths of her dark eyes, and the firelight glistened on her firm, oiled limbs as she rubbed her hands against her thighs with rising excitement. Acutely aware of the woman's desires, Conan looked into his wine cup. The surface of the liquid gleamed like polished silver. Then, as Conan drank deeply of the dark wine, his manhood responded to the lust she radiated. Still, he distrusted her. He could not have told why, save that there were strange things about her and the place in which she lived. He noted the smile, which suddenly became a frozen mask, drained of all entrancing warmth. And the eyes, which lost, for a moment only, all humanity. "They said you would come." She spoke in a sibilant whisper, while her eyes, phosphorescent in the firelight, were fixed upon him. "From the north, they said. A man of great strength, a conqueror, a humbler of kings, who would one day seize a throne for himself and hold it against the red tides of war and treachery. One who would crush the serpents of the earth beneath his sandaled feet. Serpents. Did you say serpents? Conan's voice was razor sharp, and his glance was keen upon her. She returned, look for look. What seek you in the south, barbarian? Speak truth now. A standard. On a shield, perhaps, or on a banner. There are two serpents, face to face, yet they are one, joined at the tail. He clenched his fists, remembering. Upholding a black sun, with ebon rays. The woman added, nodding. You know whereof I speak. Conan moved forward, grasping the woman by her upper arms. She slid out of his grasp, her shadow not quite keeping up with her. I know. But there is a price, barbarian. Name it, growled the Cimmerian. A smile curved her full lips as, arms spread wide, she moved towards him. Conan's blood surged within him as he took her into the circle of his arms and felt her breasts and thighs pressed against him. She fumbled in her excitement to loosen her garments and his. And, all thoughts of resistance vanquished, he gave himself over to the ecstasy of her passion. Their naked bodies glistened in the firelight as she writhed against him, her breath hot with desire. Conan responded in an impassioned blend of need and pain. All thought vanished in the intensity of his emotion. He felt her fingers clawing at his back and stroking his unruly hair, but his passion absorbed him utterly. As he neared his climax, a faint moan sounded in the woman's throat. She whispered a message, no less ferocious than her lovemaking. In Shadizar of Zamora, the crossroads of the world, you will find that which you seek. But you would be a fool to go. Only fools seek their own death. Then, convulsed in a violent orgasm, she took her ultimate pleasure of him, and he of her. Something, he did not know what, caused him to open his eyes a heartbeat later. A revulsion of horror replaced the passion of the earlier moment. Crom, he breathed. For, even as he watched the woman in his arms, her white teeth lengthened into fangs like those of a wolf. Her lips and nipples turned an iridescent blue, and the fingers that clutched his shoulders became flesh-searing claws, like the talons of some monstrous, predatory bird. A dark smoke rose in serpentine wisps from nostrils set in a burgeoning snout, and the tongue that darted out was the forked tongue of a serpent. Conan, still locked in an embrace of love, found himself enveloped in the unrelenting arms of death. He struggled to free himself from the hideous thing that wound limbs of iron about him, like the coils of a giant snake. And when her eyelids lifted, he found himself confronting the slit-pupilled orbs of no earthly woman. All his strength, he realized, could not free him from the fate that awaited him. Then he remembered his training in the pit and the wrestling tricks Uldin had taught him. While the demon woman clutched him closer, Conan ceased to struggle. Suddenly he twisted and rolled with her towards the fire, thrusting her scaled, inhuman back against the burning coals. Her long locks, which seemed to have developed a serpentine life of their own, hissed as they burst into flame. Shrieking, the monster strove to rise from the dancing flames. Then it shrank and blackened, while jets of coloured fire exploded into whirling sparks. From the incinerated body, a weightless fireball arose and spun around the chamber, shedding a momentary radiance on the hanging hides and the skulls of the animals. The door burst open, as if from the pressure of an unseen hand, and the fireball careened out into the darkness. A dwindling spark, like a shooting star, quickly vanished into the distance. With it, a lingering cry of agony faded into nothingness. Bathed in cold sweat and weak from the release of tension, the young Cimmerian sank to his knees and began groping for his clothing. "Crom!" he exclaimed, and followed the word with a curse. The stench of burning flesh was swept from the room by the night wind that poured in through the open door. The hearth fire sank to a bed of smouldering coals. As Conan went to close the door against the chill wind and the evil things that infest the dark hours, his eye fell upon the huddled being whose alert gaze reflected the red glow of the fire. Ensorcelled by the witch-woman, Conan had completely forgotten the miserable creature, who now regarded him inscrutably. "Food!" the prisoner croaked. "I starve, barbarian. I've had no food for days." "Who says you'll have some now?" scowled Conan. "What are you doing here?" "I'm dinner for the wolves, pets of the witch-woman. She put a spell on me and bound me here. Just leave me food, so I may have the strength when the wolves come to die fighting like a man." "Who are you?" rumbled Conan. The small man rose and faced Conan with a dignity that belied his misery and his rags. "I am Subotai, a Hyrcanian of the Curlate tribe. In happier days, an archer, an assassin, and a thief." Conan studied the Hyrcanian. He was small and as lean as a ferret. His set of head and shoulders reflected stealth and cunning, hard-bitten courage, and an honesty that Conan found to his liking. Here, he thought, is a man who might throw a lie in your face, but would never stab you in the back. As beady black eyes watched hopefully, Conan searched the hut, located the keys, and, by the light of the rising moon, unlocked the shackles. The little man grinned crookedly as he staggered towards the open door, rubbing his unshackled limbs. Conan waved him in. "Eat and drink," he growled. While Subotai gnawed on the remains of Conan's supper and guzzled the wine, the Cimmerian prowled around the hut, selecting things that he might need and things that pleased him. A silver-mounted belt, a sheath for his sword, gem-studded wristlets, a pendant carved in a strange design, and a hooded cloak of heavy fur to replace the untanned wolfskins which had begun to stink. Dawn was a pale gleam across the vast reaches of the treeless plain as Conan threw open the door of the witch's cabin to watch the break of day. Silver light glinted on a thin blanket of new-fallen snow, snow that would melt in the sun's warmth, but now wrapped the bare earth in the shell-pink mantle of a queen. The barbarian youth, breathing the clean air, was eager to be gone from this place of vile enchantments. He turned to his companion who sat, hugging his knees, beside the embers. "Now that you are free, whither do you go?" he asked. "To Zamora," the Hyrcanian replied, grinning. "The capital, Shadizar, is a city of thieves, and thievery is my business." "You told me that you were a man of war," said Conan, looking at the small man keenly. I come from a race of generals. The essence of warfare is deception. So I learned the way by practicing the art of theft. Subotai, black eyes sparkling, looked up at Conan with his crooked smile. An unhealthy profession, so they say. And what do you say, Cimmerian? I am a slayer of men. Subotai's laugh rang against the stone walls of the hut. More sanguine than thievery, to be sure, but of a more limited future. Thieves seldom get caught, and if they are, get beaten. But murderers are crucified. Then why were you trussed up here for wolf bait? I did not know it was a witch from whom I tried to steal. She caught me in the web of her enchantments, as she did you. Now, thanks to you, I have no need to steal. Conan, restive, lingered at the door, while Subotai rummaged among the witch's things, plucking a fur garment from a chest, choosing a bow and quiver of arrows to his liking, and strapping a scabbarded curved sword to his belt. Conan watched with approval as the Mongol swept the remaining food into a sack and slung the bag across his shoulder. They left the hut together. Ahead of them lay rolling hills, bright crested with dawn's liquid gold, and smudged here and there where scrub oaks, black and gaunt, broke through the thin blanket of snow. I too am bound southwards for Zamora, Conan said briefly. Then shall we go together? Suggested Subotai. It is good to have a friend at your back when trouble comes. Conan looked down at the small man at his side and shrugged. Do you know the road to Zamora? Subotai nodded. Conan shouldered his gear. Then let's be on our way.